How do you know when it's time for you to go when you're in ministry? Well, there are a lot of differing ideas about this, but the first thing is this. The most conventional wisdom I've ever received consistently is that you should never leave when there are problems. Unfortunately, when there are problems, that's the time you want to leave the most. And I would be lying if I didn't say that I was guilty of this sometimes, that when I was going through hardness or difficult circumstances or there were battles taking place, that I didn't want to just cut and run. But one of my heroes is Harold Seidler, and he would usually say this: it's a lot easier for them to move their membership than it is for me to move my furniture. You'll find that some of the sweetest and most wonderful times in your ministry are going to come after times of battle and challenges and difficulty, that God may do some pruning during that time, and that God would grant some peace on the other side. Pruning within your church may be painful when you're going through the circumstance and the situation, but ultimately you must remember that God's intention and purpose is that your church would be planted in Him and that it would bring forth much fruit. And oftentimes it's those times of pruning and removing of different people and circumstances and things and programs and ministries and so on that allow for you to yield more fruit on the other side of it. Fruitfulness comes through faithfulness, and faithfulness is measured in decades. Often in taking an existing church for revitalization or doing church planting ministry, you can feel like you're never going to get off of the ground. But someone said we often overestimate what we can do in 1 year and underestimate what we can do in 10. J. Harold Smith said that success is missed by most preachers because by the time their ship comes in, they've already left the dock. So just make sure that you're not giving up too early. But ultimately, the determining factor is the will of the Lord. One of my other great heroes is Adrian Rogers, and when asked this question about how long a pastor should stay, Adrian Rogers said, you ought to be willing to stay the rest of your life or to leave in the next 15 minutes. During his ministry, Adrian Rogers pastored a church in Fellsmere, Florida, which is just a very small town just northwest of the Treasure Coast. Then when he went off to seminary, he pastored in Waveland, Louisiana, a very small church there. It was a little bit larger, and it grew during his ministry there. At the conclusion of his time in seminary and the rounding down of that ministry, he was offered a position in Fort Pierce, Florida, and he felt that the Lord was leading him there. And he stayed there for probably about a decade and saw tremendous growth in the church until God called him to the First Baptist Church of Merritt Island. The First Baptist Church of Merritt Island is where he gained his initial notoriety, and he thought that he would stay there the rest of his life. But there came a time where he was asked to fill the pulpit at Bellevue Baptist Church, and things were going really well at the First Baptist Church of Merritt Island. There had been a lot of people getting saved, a lot of new young families who were coming in. The church was growing and thriving. And Bellevue Baptist Church, though, had just gone through the experience of having their former pastor, the late, great Dr. R.G. Lee, moving off of the scene from that church. And when Adrian Rogers preached there, they actually voted him in as the pastor. And he said, I didn't come here to candidate. But ultimately what ended up happening was that they told him that they felt like that it was God's will for him to be the pastor of the church, and he started praying about it and believed that that was God's will too. And though it was hard for him, they said goodbye to all of the folk at First Baptist Church and Merritt Island and went up to the Bellevue Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee. And I say that ultimately say this, to remember that you are God's man and He called you first to Himself, and that we must remember that we are to remain entirely surrendered to Him, whether that is that He leads you to stay and does not open the door for you to run away and go somewhere else away from your problems, or that He leads you to go. And maybe sometimes that means that you leave some place that's comfortable where you've been building a life as a family, but that you need to be ready to do what it is that God wants you to do and not something that you just orchestrate yourself. But I find that God doesn't typically move people around as often as many people just move themselves around. And I know some people who are at a new place every 2, 3, 4, 5 years, constantly going from place to place. A person like that never really has the heart of the people in mind when he's doing that. He's not a real shepherd, he's just a hireling. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. I realize that there might be some people that God uses specifically for the purpose of revitalization, to get the church up to a certain level and to move on. But a person like that should probably be upfront about their kind of ministry. Be aware of these guys who are just constantly moving from place to place to place to place, and there's just no intention of staying ever. That might happen once or twice in a man's ministry, and maybe there may be some extenuating circumstances, but decades of just moving around all the time, it should be incredibly abnormal. Many times what's actually happening with a person like that is that they grow to a point of their own growth lid and they come up against a wall, and the wall is really themselves, and they're unwilling to grow past that because for some reason there is pain related to the change that they're unwilling to make. If you stay in the same place for a long period of time, it's going to force you to come up against your weaknesses and to constantly grow, and that is pretty uncomfortable, but it is necessary, and it can drive us deeper in our relationship with the Lord. Just realize that there can sometimes be some kind of a growth barrier, and that growth barrier can be you. And if you will just determine that you're going to stick it out and try to grow past that, that God can do greater things through your life. Often within the first couple of years of coming to a church, you can blame the former pastor for all of the problems that you inherit. But eventually, after you stay for a little while, probably years 5 and beyond, all of the problems are ones that you created, and that can be a really hard reality to face. They often say that the church takes on the pastor's personality by about year 5. So by then, it almost feels like that when you stand up on Sunday morning and you see the deficiencies of the church, that it's really just a reflection of yourself. And you've got to make a choice at that point if you're going to cut and run or if you're going to stay and grow. And barring any other extenuating circumstances where God makes it apparent that it's time for you to move on and that he wants to grow you by moving you on somewhere else, then the default condition should be that we intend to just stick it out and keep on growing.